They called it the workhorse of the Wehrmacht, the German Mittlerer Zugkraftwagen 8T heavy half-track tractor. It was a machine that had towed the feared 88mm flak guns across Europe, hauled supplies through the endless mud of the Eastern Front, and dragged artillery through terrain that would have stopped ordinary trucks dead in their tracks. American soldiers had seen these massive half-tracks littering roadsides as they advanced through Germany. Some burned out, others abandoned for lack of fuel, and a few captured intact as the German war machine collapsed in 1945. But few Americans had ever actually driven one. Not until that spring, when U.S. crews finally climbed into the driver's seats of captured German tractors and brought their Maybach engines roaring back to life. They expected precision, efficiency, and the legendary quality of German engineering. What they found instead would upend those assumptions and reveal something deeper about why the Third Reich, for all its engineering brilliance, was doomed to fail. Sometimes the most telling evidence of an empire's downfall isn't found in battle plans or speeches, but in the simple numbers: how much fuel a vehicle burns per mile, how long it can stay in the field before it runs dry. By late 1944, the tide of war had turned decisively against Germany. The Allies had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France toward the Rhine. Behind them stretched a vast logistical network: convoys of fuel trucks, repair units, depots, and workshops keeping the American advance moving. Every gallon of gasoline had to cross the Atlantic, land at French ports, and be hauled hundreds of miles to the front. Fuel efficiency wasn't a luxury. It was a matter of victory or defeat. To sustain that advance, the U.S. Army had built its mechanized forces around standardized vehicles. Chief among them was the M3 half-track, an unglamorous but essential workhorse of American mobility. Powered by a white 160AX six-cylinder gasoline engine producing about 148 horsepower, the M3 wasn't especially powerful, but it was reliable, easy to maintain, and, most importantly, mass-producible using existing American truck components. It could carry a dozen troops, tow light artillery, or serve as a mobile gun platform. On roads, its 60-gallon tank gave it a range of roughly 220 miles, about 3.7 miles per gallon. Off-road, that figure dropped closer to 2. American soldiers knew their M3s were far from fuel efficient, but they accepted that trade-off for rugged dependability. The German CDK F-77, however, was built on a very different philosophy. Developed in the 1930s, it was designed not for troop transport, but for raw pulling power, especially for towing the iconic 88mm flak gun and heavy howitzers. Beneath its steel hood sat a Maybach HL62T2K engine, later upgraded to the HL64TR. These were six-cylinder, water-cooled gasoline engines producing around 140 horsepower, nearly identical to the M3s on paper. But that's where the similarities ended. The Maybach engine displaced over 6 liters and guzzled fuel at a staggering rate. German technical manuals listed its consumption at about 80 liters per 100 kilometers, roughly 3 miles per gallon on good roads. In the mud and snow of the Eastern Front, that could double to a shocking 160 liters per 100 kilometers, or barely 1.5 miles per gallon. Its 215-liter fuel tank, about 57 gallons, gave it a theoretical range of 150 miles. In combat conditions, it often ran dry after half that distance. During the war, Allied intelligence analysts had rarely noticed or cared. They focused on armor thickness, gun calibers, and aircraft performance, not gas mileage. But that changed in the spring of 1945, when the U.S. Ninth Army crossed into Germany and began capturing hundreds of intact vehicles. One American ordnance officer, whose name was lost to history but whose actions were preserved in reports, decided to do more than just catalog the abandoned machines. His supply unit needed heavy tractors to move artillery and bridge equipment. And right there, in a captured German motor pool, sat several nearly new Steg KKFZ 7s, abandoned simply because they were out of fuel. They decided to put them back into action. The Maybach engines ran on gasoline, the same as American vehicles, so refueling was easy. None of the American drivers had ever handled a German half-track, and the controls were alien. The labels were in German, the levers arranged differently, and the clutch felt heavier. But with some trial and error, and the typical ingenuity of GIs, they soon got the hulking machines started. The first impression was impressive. The deep growl of the Maybach, the mechanical smoothness, the power. One sergeant described it in a letter home as like driving a locomotive. The tracks gripped the muddy ground beautifully, and the half-track hauled artillery with ease where American vehicles sometimes struggled. For a moment, the myth of German engineering seemed justified. Officers watching the test were impressed, even taking notes on the suspension and towing capacity, wondering if the Army could learn from the design. But that admiration didn't last. After only a few days in operation, the American crews noticed a serious problem. The fuel gauges were dropping fast, too fast. Each Mittlerer Zugkraftwagen 8T had been filled with a full 57 gallons of American gasoline. The drivers expected to get at least 150 or 200 miles before refueling. Instead, the tanks were empty after fewer than 90 miles of mixed road and off-road travel. At first, they assumed a mistake. Maybe the tanks hadn't been full. Maybe there was a leak. Or maybe the drivers were being too heavy on the throttle. But as the days went on, the pattern repeated. The German half-tracks were burning fuel at nearly twice the rate of the American M3s. The ordnance captain decided to run a proper test. He selected one M3 and one Mittlerer Zugkraftwagen 8T in perfect condition. Both were filled to the brim with gasoline. The route was identical: 25 miles of paved road, 15 miles of cross-country terrain, and then 25 miles back. Each would tow a standard 15-centimeter howitzer, roughly the same weight load. The results were eye-opening. The M3 completed the entire 65-mile circuit with fuel to spare, having burned about 17 gallons, roughly 3.8 miles per gallon. The Steg KFZ 7, under the same conditions, ran completely dry before reaching the end. Calculations showed it had consumed nearly 63 gallons, barely 1 mile per gallon. Someone did the math on a larger scale. Moving a battalion's artillery 100 miles with 10 M3 half-tracks would burn about 2,600 gallons. Doing the same with SETI KFZ 7s would consume over 6,000 gallons. Multiply that across divisions, corps, or entire armies, and you are talking about tens of thousands of gallons a day. An impossible logistical burden for a nation already strangled by fuel shortages. In that moment, the American officers realized something profound. Germany's downfall wasn't just about lost battles or failed strategies, it was about engineering choices. The German military had built magnificent machines, but they had designed them as if fuel would always be plentiful. Before the war, Germany had captured Romanian oil fields and invested in synthetic fuel production. They assumed that future conquests, like the oil-rich Caucasus, would supply everything else. Efficiency was never the priority. The United States, on the other hand, had been forced to think about logistics from the start. Its vehicles were designed not just for performance, but for production, maintenance, and fuel economy. Every gallon mattered when you were shipping it across the ocean. The M3's simpler engine might not have been glamorous, but it kept armies moving. As the Americans continued to drive the captured SETI KFZ 7s deeper into Germany, they grew more aware of how fragile the enemy's war machine had become. Roads were littered with wrecked or abandoned vehicles, not because they were destroyed in combat, but because they had run out of fuel. Even tanks and self-propelled guns were being ditched by their crews. The Wehrmacht wasn't beaten only on the battlefield. It was suffocated by its own fuel consumption. One intelligence report filed weeks later put it bluntly: the German army has engineered itself into immobility. What looked like mechanical superiority on paper had, in reality, become a strategic weakness. Their vehicles were over-engineered, overpowered, and over-thirsty. In a war of attrition, that was fatal. By the time American units reached the Elbe River, the Stukav-Ster-7s were mostly parked again, too inefficient to justify their use. They had proven their worth as engineering marvels, and their failure as tools of sustained warfare. In the quiet moments after the war, as U.S. analysts studied captured German designs, they saw the same pattern everywhere. Tanks, planes, trucks, all brilliant, all demanding, all unsustainable. The half-track test had been a small experiment, but it symbolized a larger truth. Germany had built weapons for short, decisive wars. America had built machines for the long haul. And that difference between speed and sustainability, between complexity and practicality, was one of the hidden reasons why the Allies kept advancing while the Wehrmacht ran out of gas, both literally and figuratively. The German Mittlerer Zugkraftwagen AT remains an icon of WWII engineering, massive, powerful, and beautifully made. But to the American soldiers who drove it in those final months of the war, it was more than a captured trophy. It was proof that even the best-designed machine can fail if it's built on the wrong assumptions. The half-track that once hauled the guns of the Reich had become a symbol of its exhaustion, a reminder that power without endurance is just another way to lose a war. Oil had to be shipped across submarine-infested oceans. It had to be pumped into tankers, guarded by destroyers, unloaded at distant ports, and then transported hundreds of miles by rail and truck to reach the front lines. Every drop that reached a soldier or a tank in Europe represented a staggering logistical effort. American industry understood that efficiency was not optional. It was survival. U.S. engineers built engines that squeezed every mile from every gallon, not because they were more ingenious than their German counterparts, but because the American system demanded it. Germany had designed its machines for power and speed. America had designed hers for endurance. As more captured German vehicles came under American control in the spring of 1945, the pattern became undeniable. From heavy trucks to tanks to aircraft, the same story repeated itself. Excessive fuel consumption, over-engineering, and short operational range. The German Opel Blitz truck, famous for supplying Wehrmacht divisions, burned more fuel than an American GMC or Studebaker cargo truck while hauling less tonnage. The Mercedes-Benz models, though beautifully built, were equally inefficient. German tanks like the Panther and Tiger were technological marvels, but on the road they barely achieved a mile per gallon. Even the Luftwaffe's fighter planes and bombers devoured fuel at rates that made sustained operations nearly impossible once German fuel production collapsed. American intelligence officers collected these figures with growing fascination. They began to realize that the entire German military system had been engineered for a type of war that no longer existed. A short, violent campaign of conquest, where the enemy's oil reserves would quickly become Germany's. In 1939 and 1940, this approach had worked brilliantly. Poland and France fell in weeks, and fuel captured from enemy depots kept the panzers rolling. But by 1943 and 1944, as the Allies bombed Germany's synthetic fuel plants and seized control of vital oil fields, the same vehicles that had powered Blitzkrieg became anchors dragging the Reich to defeat. American soldiers examining the captured, Mittlere Zugkraftwagen 8T half-tracks began to notice other revealing details. Everything about the vehicles screamed overengineering. The frames were built like tank hulls. The drive systems were complex, with heavy overlapping wheels and intricate track mechanisms that required precise alignment. The Maybach engines were masterpieces of design, but also nightmares to maintain. They used advanced fuel injection systems that required expert calibration. A single misadjustment could send fuel consumption soaring. The Americans compared this to their own M3 half-tracks white engine. It was based on commercial truck designs, simple and rugged, forgiving of dust, mud, and imperfect tuning. Its carburetor could be cleaned and adjusted with basic tools, and it had been designed with one guiding principle: fuel efficiency. American automotive engineers had spent decades designing for the civilian market, where buyers cared deeply about operating costs. Those same lessons carried directly into wartime production. On the battlefield, the difference was stark. A U.S. mechanized infantry company operating a dozen M3 half-tracks could move 20 to 30 miles in a day using around 200 gallons of fuel. If that same unit had been equipped with German ZKF-77s, it would have needed close to 500 gallons for the same mission. Scaled to an entire division, the numbers became staggering. American logistics planners calculated that a frontline division required roughly 50,000 gallons of fuel each day to keep its vehicles moving. Tanks, trucks, half-tracks, and support vehicles combined. A German panzer division with its thirstier vehicles required nearly 75,000 gallons for the same operational output. Early in the war, when Germany was on the offensive and capturing Soviet or French fuel depots, such consumption was manageable. But by 1944, when Allied bombers were destroying refineries and synthetic fuel plants, it became catastrophic. American soldiers who drove captured ZKKFs 7s learned this firsthand. They found themselves refueling twice as often as they would in their own M3s. They watched their fuel gauges fall visibly while driving and began to understand, in a very personal way, why so many German vehicles had been left behind intact. The Germans had not abandoned them because of mechanical failure. They had abandoned them because they had nothing left to burn. One particularly telling incident took place in April 1945 as American forces advanced through central Germany. A mixed supply convoy of American and captured German half-tracks was ordered to deliver ammunition and rations to artillery units 80 miles behind the front. Every vehicle began the trip fully fueled. The M3s made the round trip without stopping for gas and returned with fuel to spare. The German ZKF-77s, running the same route, had to be refueled halfway through the journey. Without that emergency stop, they would have been stranded. The convoy commander, a seasoned logistics officer, noted in his after-action report, German vehicles unsuitable for sustained operations due to excessive fuel consumption. Reports like this poured in from all across occupied Germany. A tank recovery unit discovered that German heavy wreckers, variants of the CDKKFC-9, could pull immobilized tanks that even American M1A1 wreckers struggled with. Yet they required so much fuel that refueling convoys had to follow them everywhere, turning recovery missions into prolonged ordeals. An artillery battalion that briefly used captured Stuhlkefs 7s praised their traction in mud, but complained that they needed fuel trucks to accompany every movement, which nullified their tactical advantages. The Americans even noticed flaws in the German fuel tank design itself. The Mittlere Zugkraftwagen 8T carried about 215 liters, around 57 gallons, of fuel, slightly less than the M3's 60-gallon tank. But given its much higher rate of consumption, that capacity was inadequate. It was as if the engineers had never tested how quickly their machines would burn fuel under combat conditions. Some American maintenance crews tried to make the German vehicles more efficient. They adjusted carburetors, fine-tuned ignition timing, and experimented with gentler driving habits. They managed minor improvements, perhaps 5 to 10%, but nothing that could close the enormous gap. The Maybach's large displacement and heavy frame simply consumed too much energy to move. There was a grim irony to it all. American fuel was being shipped from Texas and Oklahoma across the Atlantic to keep captured German machines running on German soil, while German units only miles away sat immobilized for lack of fuel. What better symbol of the war's outcome could there be? By early 1944, German fuel production had peaked at about 5.7 million tons per year. 1 year later, after relentless Allied bombing and the loss of the Romanian oil fields to the Soviets, production had collapsed by more than 80%. Synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Berlin, and Pulitz were bombed repeatedly. Entire refineries were reduced to rubble. The Luftwaffe was hit hardest. By late 1944, most training flights for new pilots were cancelled because fuel was too precious to waste. Experienced flyers rationed their missions, while others practiced in simulators or bicycles with mocked-up cockpits. Tank divisions were ordered to minimize movement. The once proud panzer forces often relied on horse-drawn wagons for supplies, an astonishing regression for an army that had invented blitzkrieg. Even with strict rationing, it wasn't enough. German divisions found themselves immobilized, unable to retreat or counterattack. Tanks sat in forests or villages waiting for deliveries that never came. Some were blown up by their own crews to prevent capture. Others were left by the roadside, their fuel drained into smaller vehicles that might still move. American after-action reports from the final months of the war are filled with anecdotes illustrating this collapse. One armored division described how a captured Panther tank fought brilliantly in a short engagement, but had to be abandoned after just 15 miles because it had emptied its fuel tanks. Another engineering unit reported that the German half-tracks they used for heavy towing performed superbly, but burned fuel like it was going out of style. Soon, those vehicles were relegated to short-range work or stripped for parts. A few STD-KK-7s found new life as stationary generators, their engines powering lights and workshops at forward bases. Others were parked permanently and cannibalized. Once the pride of the Wehrmacht's mechanized power, they now symbolized the inefficiency that had crippled it. The lesson wasn't lost on American commanders. German equipment looked impressive, sounded impressive, and often performed well in isolated situations, but it couldn't sustain itself. The Wehrmacht had never solved the central challenge of mechanized warfare, not how to build powerful machines, but how to keep them supplied. The U.S. Army had solved it through logistics. As General Dwight Eisenhower famously observed, "Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics." The fuel consumption gap between German and American machines was the perfect embodiment of that truth. The Germans built tactically superior vehicles. The Panther outgunned and out-armored the Sherman. The Mittlerer Zugkraftwagen 8T could tow heavier loads than the M3, but their brilliance meant little when the tanks ran dry or the tractors stopped dead on a roadside. America's triumph lay not just in factories and technology, but in organization. From oil wells in Texas and California, crude oil traveled to refineries in Baton Rouge, Baytown, and Tulsa. From there, it was shipped to East Coast ports, loaded into tankers, and sent across the Atlantic in convoys protected by destroyers and aircraft. Once in Europe, it was pumped ashore through the artificial harbors of Normandy, loaded onto Red Ball Express trucks, and driven night and day to the front. It was a river of fuel, and it never stopped flowing. The refined fuel that powered America's vast war machine began its journey thousands of miles from the battlefields of Europe. Crude oil, drawn from wells in Texas, Oklahoma, and California, was refined into aviation gasoline, diesel, and motor fuel. Once processed, it was loaded onto massive tankers and sent eastward across the Atlantic, through waters haunted by German U-boats. These convoys of blacked-out ships carried not just fuel, but the pulse of the Allied advance. Every drop was fought for. Every crossing was a gamble between fire and survival. Yet, despite the submarines and the storms, the tankers kept coming. Once across the ocean, the fuel was offloaded at ports in Britain, France, or later, liberated Belgium. There, American logisticians transformed what could have been chaos into order. Steel drums, tank trucks, and rail cars moved the lifeblood of modern war inland. Trains rumbled through the night, their cars filled with gasoline bound for forward depots. From there, convoys of trucks carried it closer to the front. Up ruined French roads, over makeshift bridges, and into hastily established fuel dumps. Each gallon traveled through a vast and intricate chain, from refinery to tanker, from tanker to rail car, from rail car to truck, from truck to soldier. It was a feat of coordination unmatched in history. For every gallon that reached the front lines, 4 gallons were spent along the way, consumed by the ships, trains, and vehicles that delivered it. But the miracle was that the system worked. In the final year of the war, American armored columns almost never stalled for lack of fuel. Gasoline flowed like blood through veins of steel. The Red Ball Express, that endless convoy of trucks roaring day and night from Normandy to the front, became a legend. Drivers slept in their cabs, ate cold rations, and drove until their hands cramped because they knew what happened when the fuel stopped. Tanks became tombs. The German army, by contrast, was suffocating. Its once proud logistics system had collapsed into ruin. The synthetic fuel plants that produced most of Germany's gasoline were burning wrecks, bombed day and night by Allied aircraft. The great Romanian oil fields, once the Reich's main supply, were gone, seized by the Soviets in August 1944. Whatever fuel Germany could still produce had to be divided among collapsing fronts, carried by trains that no longer ran on time, across bridges that no longer existed, along roads strafed daily by Allied fighters. But even if Germany had somehow preserved its refineries and oil fields, it would have faced the same inescapable problem. Its vehicles drank fuel like water. American intelligence studies in mid-1945 calculated that Germany would have needed at least 25% more fuel production, simply to maintain the same operational tempo as the Americans. And that was assuming no bombing, no loss of oil fields, no enemy interference. German tanks and trucks were marvels of engineering, but disasters of endurance. The Panther tank, widely regarded as one of the best tanks of the war, consumed roughly twice as much fuel per mile as an American Sherman, half a mile to the gallon, a figure that would have horrified any American logistics officer. For every German tank that rolled, 2 Shermans could travel the same distance on the same fuel. And then there were the heavy tank destroyers, the Jagdpanther, the Jagdtiger, massive, intimidating, armed with guns that could destroy an enemy tank before it was even in range. But they were also among the most fuel-hungry machines ever built. One post-war report noted, almost incredulously, that a Jagdtiger idling for an hour burned more fuel than a Sherman driving 10 miles. They were monsters of power, but they starved themselves to death. By April 1945, Germany was littered with the corpses of its own machines. Roadsides were lined with abandoned half-tracks, trucks, and tanks, not because they had been destroyed, but because they were dry. The crews had simply walked away, leaving engines that had no fuel to run. The Americans who captured them began to see the war's end not in battles, but in the empty gas tanks of the enemy. The intelligence reports told the same story. At Germany's height, in 1941 and 1942, its fuel production and captured reserves barely sustained its forces. As the war dragged on, the equation turned fatal. Bombed refineries, lost oil fields, blockaded ports. By 1944, many German armored divisions could not move at all without seizing enemy fuel. The Ardennes offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, was the last desperate gamble. Every German planner knew they did not have enough fuel for the operation, but the plan assumed that they would capture American fuel dumps along the way and use that gasoline to keep advancing. It was a plan born of hope, not logic. When the offensive began in December 1944, some German units did seize small American depots, but the quantities were nowhere near enough to sustain the attack. American engineers, anticipating this, had destroyed most of their fuel stocks before retreating. At Stavelot, a massive American fuel dump containing hundreds of thousands of gallons was blown sky-high just hours before German forces arrived. The explosion shook the ground for miles and turned the night sky into a burning inferno. Without those captured supplies, the German advance sputtered. Tanks ran dry within days. By December 18th, the once mighty armored spearheads were stranded. Some of the fearsome Panther tanks covered less than 30 miles before their fuel gauges hit zero. The vaunted half-tracks that towed artillery, the famed Ravens, were abandoned in ditches, their crews forced to continue on foot. When American forces later interrogated captured German officers, the stories were grimly repetitive. Orders to advance, but no fuel to obey them. Artillery units that sat helplessly silent. Their guns full of shells, but their tractors bone dry. One captured lieutenant, questioned in January 1945, admitted that his unit had been immobilized for days, watching the front collapse around them. His report concluded with chilling simplicity. We had the will to fight, but not the fuel to move. The Americans reading these reports could not help but marvel at the irony. German engineering had created magnificent machines, but machines that could not feed themselves. As one officer dryly remarked, they built the world's best tanks, but forgot to build the world to fuel them. Among American troops, the stories became almost folklore. GIs swapped tales about captured German vehicles, about how powerful they were, how smooth they drove, and how absurdly fast their fuel gauges dropped. A corporal wrote home about driving a captured German half-track, only to realize he needed to refuel twice as often as in his usual M3. A sergeant complained in a letter that his captured ZKFZ-27 ran out of fuel after just 60 miles. What began as curiosity ended as frustration, and then as understanding. They saw in those empty tanks the reason for Germany's collapse. The Americans had built a war machine that could endure. Not the fastest, not the flashiest, but the one that could keep moving. Germany had built for power. America had built for distance. Across the ruined countryside of Germany in early 1945, the evidence lay everywhere. Panther tanks, their armor still gleaming beneath the soot, stranded with open hatches. Half-tracks half-sunk in ditches, wheels caked with mud, engines silent. The Americans began marking them with chalk or paint. Out of gas, or thanks for the ride. There was a kind of grim humor in it, but also a profound recognition. Germany had lost the fuel war long before it lost the shooting war. The Studi KKF-7 became the symbol of that realization. It had been one of Germany's proudest designs, a versatile half-track capable of towing heavy artillery, recovering tanks, and carrying troops across rugged terrain. It was fast, strong, beautifully engineered, and utterly unsustainable. It burned twice the fuel of its American counterpart, the M3. In a world where every drop of fuel came at the cost of lives and convoys, that difference was fatal. After the war, many German officers tried to explain their defeat by pointing to the Allied bombing campaign, or the two-front war, or the overwhelming numbers of American industry. But those who studied the matter closely understood the deeper truth. The German war machine had consumed itself. Its designs were brilliant, but blind to endurance. Its vehicles won battles, but lost wars. For the Americans, the lesson was unmistakable. Power is nothing without sustainment. The best tank, the best truck, the best aircraft, all are useless if they cannot be kept supplied. The German army's failure to balance performance with logistics had doomed it long before its soldiers realized it. As the war ended in May 1945, American forces captured thousands of German vehicles, many in pristine condition, but all empty. They stood as silent monuments to a fatal miscalculation. The young captain who had once decided to compare a captured Siebenhundert KFZ-07 to an American M3 half-track could never have imagined the historical weight of his experiment. He had been testing fuel efficiency. In doing so, he had uncovered a truth that stretched far beyond the battlefield. The Germans had built for might. The Americans had built for movement. One philosophy dazzled, the other endured. And in the long, grinding war that consumed continents, it was endurance that won. When the war finally ended, not every captured German machine was scrapped or destroyed. Some were carefully shipped back across the Atlantic, bound for the proving grounds of the United States. At Aberdeen in Maryland, engineers and mechanics waited, eager to take apart the weapons that had once terrified them on the battlefield. They disassembled engines, studied fuel injection systems, examined transmissions, and documented every bolt, piston, and gear tooth. The verdict, even before the testing began, was clear. German engineering was brilliant, but not without flaws. When the engines were mounted onto dynamometers and run through their full power cycles, the results were both fascinating and damning. The German vehicles, for all their technical sophistication, were monstrously inefficient. The Maybach HL62 engine used in the Mittlerer Zugkraftwagen 8T half-track, one of the workhorses of the German army, drank fuel at an astonishing rate. It consumed roughly 30% more fuel per horsepower than its American counterpart, the White 160AX. The reason wasn't incompetence. In fact, it was the opposite. German engineers had pushed for maximum power, for reliability under extreme conditions, for raw mechanical perfection. But in doing so, they had sacrificed efficiency. The Americans found the problem in the details. The Maybach used a relatively low compression ratio, robbing it of thermal efficiency. Its carburetor ran rich, constantly feeding more fuel than necessary to guarantee operation in cold or dusty environments. Even the ignition timing favored power over economy. These decisions made sense when designing for performance, but not for a global war where every gallon of gasoline mattered. When the Americans analyzed the Stu KFZ-7's entire powertrain, the same pattern emerged. The transmission, though rugged, used wide gear ratios that forced the engine to run at high RPMs. The final drive was tuned for torque, not cruising. It was an engineering masterpiece optimized for the wrong goal, a report written at Aberdeen in the fall of 1945 summarized the findings with remarkable clarity. The Mittlerer Zugkraftwagen 8T represents excellent engineering applied toward the wrong optimization targets. In short, the Germans built machines to win battles, not wars. The Americans knew that if they'd been handed the same design brief, tow 8 tons, carry 12 men, work in all terrain, they would have built something entirely different. Not better built, perhaps, but more efficient, easier to maintain, and less demanding on logistics. And that philosophy became a cornerstone of post-war American design. When the U.S. Army began developing new armored vehicles and transports entwined into the late 1940s, fuel efficiency was no longer an afterthought. It became a defining requirement. The Army's planners remembered those abandoned German tanks, silent along European roads, their engines empty, their crews gone. They had seen firsthand that power meant nothing if you couldn't feed it. The M59 armored personnel carrier, which replaced the wartime M3 half-track, was designed with that memory in mind. It achieved far better mileage than its predecessor, despite being larger. A decade later, the M113 continued the same tradition: light, efficient, and easy to produce. Meanwhile, Soviet engineers took a different lesson from the war. Their nation, rich in oil, never feared fuel shortages the way Germany had. Soviet vehicles of the Cold War era became notorious for their thirst. They were powerful, cheap, and numerous, but they burned fuel almost as quickly as the German machines before them. The difference was that the Soviets could afford it. The Germans could not. At Aberdeen, the American engineers did the math. The implications were staggering. By early 1945, U.S. forces in Europe were consuming 300 million gallons of gasoline every month. If their vehicles had been as inefficient as the Germans, that figure would have risen to 500 million. Supplying that much extra fuel would have required more ships, more ports, more pipelines, and might have slowed the Allied advance by months. For Germany, the picture was even bleaker. With limited oil reserves and refineries under constant attack, their fuel problem was not logistical. It was existential. By 1944, even the most powerful divisions could not maneuver as they once had. Tanks sat idle, aircraft stayed grounded, and mechanized warfare, the very heart of blitzkrieg, simply ran out of gas. Some historians now argue that fuel, not strategy, determined the final outcome in the West. German armies weren't defeated, only by enemy firepower, but by the emptiness of their own fuel tanks. They had built a war machine that no economy on Earth could sustain. After the war, a few captured ZKFZ-7s continued to serve in foreign armies, including Czechoslovakia. They ran well when they had fuel, but as newer, more efficient vehicles became available, they were quickly retired. The machines themselves were too costly to keep alive. Today, a handful survive in museums, towering, imposing relics of another age. Visitors admire their craftsmanship, their strength, their mechanical beauty. Yet few plaques mention the simple, devastating flaw that doomed them: fuel consumption. American soldiers who had driven captured German half-tracks never forgot. In memoirs and reunions decades later, they laughed about how often they had to stop for gas. You could almost watch the fuel gauge drop as you drove, one GI remembered. The German vehicles were strong, powerful, impressive, but unsustainable. And that, more than anything, captures the hidden truth of warfare. The most impressive weapon is not always the most effective one. A tank that cannot reach the battlefield is just an expensive bunker. A half-track that needs constant refueling becomes a burden, not an advantage. Germany's engineers had built marvels, but they were marvels designed for a war that existed only on paper. They had assumed endless fuel, endless production, endless conquest. The Americans had built for reality, for a war that would stretch across continents and years. By the spring of 1945, American soldiers climbing out of captured ZKFZ-7s understood something profound. The Third Reich had not merely lost the war in strategy or tactics, it had lost in logistics, in its inability to sustain what it had built. The lesson was simple, brutal, and unforgettable. Germany had built machines that demanded more than its resources could supply. America had built machines that could keep going, as long as its factories kept running and its ships kept sailing. The difference was not just mechanical. It was philosophical. German engineers pursued perfection. American engineers pursued practicality. When the perfect met the practical in a total war of attrition, the practical won. The Mittlerer Zugkraftwagen 8T and the M3 half-track tell two very different stories. The German vehicle reflected a nation's belief that superior design and performance would conquer all. The American vehicle reflected a belief that good enough, built in massive numbers, could conquer anything, and history proved the Americans right. When historians today discuss why Germany lost the war, they cite the two-front struggle, the industrial disparity, the bombing campaigns, and countless tactical errors. But hidden among those explanations lies a quieter truth, one measured not in strategy, but in miles per gallon. German vehicles burned twice as much fuel as their American equivalents. That single fact meant that every German advance carried within it the seeds of its own collapse. In 1941, a German soldier driving across the vast fields of Russia had no reason to think about fuel. The fuel depots were full, the roads open, the victories endless. But by 1945, another soldier, exhausted, surrounded, watching his fuel gauge fall to zero, understood the real limits of German power. German logistics had failed its ambition. German design had ignored its own constraints. And in the final analysis, that neglect was fatal. The Americans, practical to the core, had built a war machine that could sustain itself, efficient, maintainable, and reliable. The Germans, obsessed with power and precision, had built one that could not. So when we look back at the great machines of World War II, the tanks, the trucks, the half-tracks, we should remember that story. The story of the engineers who built brilliance into inefficiency, the soldiers who discovered that brilliance wasn't enough, and the simple, humbling truth that in modern warfare, the real victory may not be won on the battlefield at all, but at the fuel pump. Power without sustainability is weakness. Performance without efficiency is failure. The men who drove those captured half-tracks in 1945 learned that lesson the hard way. A lesson that would shape American military design for generations to come.